She saw her millionaire ex and his lover at a party. What happened next shocked everyone. A night that changed everything. The rain pounded the cobblestone streets of Barcelona that night, the rhythmic patter blending with the distant hum of the city. Clara Morales sat in her car, the window fogged up as droplets clung to the glass, reflecting the warm glow of street lamps. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles whitened by the force of her trembling hands. Her chest ached, not a physical pain, but the suffocating kind that seeps into the soul and leaves everything hollow inside. She would never forget this night, the night her life fell apart. The phone vibrated on the dashboard. Diego's name flashed on the screen. Her husband, the man she had devoted every year of the last decade to. Clara hesitated before answering, her stomach tightening into knots. "Hello," she said, her voice shaky. On the other end, there was a heavy sigh. "Clara, we need to talk." His tone was distant, cold, nothing like the warmth she once knew when he'd call her mi amor or laugh before even saying a word. "Diego, what's going on?" The silence was unbearable. "Can we meet at home soon?" he finally asked. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest. She wanted answers now. "Just say it, Diego. What's going on?" And then he said it, coldly, bluntly, without hesitation. "I want a divorce." The words hit Clara like a blow. It felt as though the ground beneath her feet had opened up, swallowing her whole. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. "Why?" Her voice cracked. "Do you love someone else?" Another silence. Then, in the background, she heard a noise, a whisper, and then a female voice. "Diego, are you going to be long?" Clara felt an electric shock run through her body. She didn't need anything else. She didn't need to hear another explanation, another excuse, another pathetic attempt to smooth things over. He was already with her at that moment. The call dropped. Clara sat there in the car, staring at nothing. The tears came silently at first, then they came like a storm. The next few days were a blur. Clara refused to leave the room. His smell still lingered on the sheets. His clothes still hung in the closet, and his wedding ring still weighed on her finger, a cruel reminder of what they had once been. She spent sleepless nights reliving every moment of their marriage, wondering when it all started to fall apart. Flashback. 2 years earlier, Clara remembered their last trip together. They were in Paris. Diego held her hand as they strolled along the Champs-Élysées, and she felt safe, loved, or at least she thought so. "Do you promise we'll come back here one day?" she had asked, smiling at him. Diego kissed her forehead. "I promise." But now, looking back, Clara wondered, when did that promise break? Were there signs she ignored? The excuses for coming home late, the increasingly frequent work trips, the way he stopped looking at her the way he used to. She realized too late that the cracks had always been there. She just refused to see them. Months later, while watching television, Clara saw a report about a gala event for Diego's company. The cameras showed couples smiling, businessmen shaking hands, and then there he was, Diego, in a black tuxedo, holding a glass of champagne. Beside him stood Melissa, the woman he had left her for, young, elegant, beautiful. Melissa wore a tight red dress, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. She smiled at Diego as if she knew exactly what she had done, as if she knew she had won. Clara felt a bitter taste in her mouth. After all, what did Melissa have that she didn't? And then, as if the universe wanted to destroy Clara completely, the reporter asked Diego, "Rumor has it that your marriage ended recently. Is that true?" Diego looked at Melissa before answering. "Some things just come to an end, but life always surprises us with new opportunities." Clara clenched her fists. Her chest burned. The tears came again, but this time, something inside her changed. She couldn't go on like this. She couldn't let Diego and Melissa win. If he could move on, then so would she. That night, Clara looked at herself in the mirror for longer than usual. The pale, haggard face of the previous months had disappeared. In its place was a woman who had learned to get back on her feet. She still bore scars, but now they were just the marks of battles won. In the beginning, it was difficult. The first step always is. After the divorce, Clara had to relearn how to live without depending on anyone. The money she received in the court settlement was enough to make a fresh start, but not to live without worries. For the first time in years, Clara faced the real world alone. At first, the job market seemed cruel. Her business degree felt almost obsolete after so many years out of the workforce, dedicated to a marriage that, in the end, left her with nothing but bitter memories. The condescending looks at job interviews, the polite rejections, and the closed doors were a blow to her already fragile self-esteem. But she didn't give up. Clara started from scratch. She took a job as an assistant in a small consultancy firm, even though she knew she was qualified for much more. She worked tirelessly, absorbing everything she could. She stayed late at the office, studied at night, and made contacts. Within a few months, she had become indispensable to the company. Within a year, she was promoted. Recognition came quickly. Her determination and intelligence were undeniable. When she realized she had learned everything she could in that job, Clara made the boldest decision of her life. She resigned and started her own company. It was a risk, sleepless nights, fear, uncertainty, but for the first time, fear didn't paralyze her. It drove her forward. She used every lesson learned in her failed marriage, every humiliation and pain, as fuel to grow. 2 years passed. Clara now owned a financial consultancy company that was growing by leaps and bounds. She had become respected in the market, an independent, confident, powerful woman. The days of crying and self-pity were behind her. She had proved to herself that happiness depended on no one but herself. That evening, while getting ready for the gala event, Clara smiled as she saw her reflection in the mirror. The elegant black dress hugged her curves perfectly. Her hair, which had always been tied up in a lifeless bun, now fell in sophisticated waves over her shoulders. The red lipstick highlighted her confidence, and the high heels made her feel even more imposing. She didn't need that party to feel validated, but it was an important event in the business world, and she had been personally invited by the host. That meant she had reached the top. The past no longer defined her. The hall was lit by crystal chandeliers and filled with business people, celebrities, and influential figures. Clara walked in with her head held high, greeting a few acquaintances. Clara felt good, as if she finally belonged there. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But then, something unexpected happened. She felt a gaze burning into her direction. Following her instinct, Clara slowly turned her head. Across the room, a man stood holding a glass of champagne, dumbfounded. His eyes were wide, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was Diego, her ex-husband, the man who had betrayed her, humiliated her, and discarded her as if she were irrelevant. Time had not been as kind to him as it had been to Clara. His face bore the marks of stress, and his eyes carried a different glow, a mix of surprise and regret. And then Clara noticed something even more shocking. Next to him, holding his arm with a tense expression, was Melissa, the woman Diego had left her for. The entire hall seemed to disappear for a moment. Everything around them lost sound, color, and movement. Only three people seemed to exist in that space: Clara, Diego, and Melissa. In that instant, Clara knew that this night would change everything. Clara felt every eye on her as she stood motionless in the center of the room. Diego was still standing there looking stunned, as if he couldn't believe the woman in front of him was real. Time had passed for both of them, but the difference was glaring. While he looked worn out, carrying the weight of choices he had perhaps already begun to question, Clara looked stunning, radiant, indomitable. Melissa noticed. She noticed before Diego even understood. His body was rigid, his eyes unable to turn away from Clara, as if he were seeing a ghost of something that had once belonged to him and now seemed unattainable. Melissa didn't like the way she felt. She didn't like the way Diego reacted. She knew that Clara was different now, more confident, more sophisticated, more powerful than ever. And that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "Darling, are you all right?" Melissa's voice was sweet, but there was something sharp in it. Diego blinked a few times, coming out of his trance, trying to disguise his astonishment. "It's just surprising. I haven't seen her for years." Melissa smiled, but her chest tightened. Lately, she had felt that Diego was distant. Little details that hadn't bothered her before now seemed to shout at her. The nights when he came home late without explanation, the silent dinners, the way he looked at his cell phone and sighed before putting it in his pocket. She didn't feel as safe as she used to. And now, seeing Clara, that insecurity grew like a shadow in her mind. So, Melissa made a decision. If Diego couldn't take his eyes off Clara, then she would make sure that Clara knew exactly who the woman next to him was now. With calculated steps, Melissa picked up her glass of champagne and walked over to Clara. Every step was rehearsed, every movement planned to the millimeter. She wasn't going to let that woman steal the show. Clara noticed Melissa approaching but showed no reaction. She already knew what was coming next. For a long time, she'd been naive enough to believe that some people simply moved on without having to destroy others. But now, she knew the truth. Melissa wasn't coming to greet her. Melissa was coming to mark her territory. "Clara, what a surprise to find you here," Melissa said, her voice sweet, but poison oozed through the words. Clara smiled, remaining impassive. "Melissa, how are you?" Melissa tilted her head slightly, as if observing something curious. "I see life has been kind to you. You look stunning." Clara held her gaze without flinching. "Life has been fair to me. And you?" The question caught Melissa off guard for a second. Her smile faltered, but soon returned to her face. "I've never been better. After all, I married the man of my dreams. Diego is a wonderful husband." Clara noticed the sparkle in Melissa's eyes, a sparkle that wasn't one of happiness, but of defiance. She didn't need to hear any more. She didn't need a dispute. Time had taught her that some battles are won simply by choosing not to fight. "I'm happy for you," Clara replied, her voice unchanged. But before she could end the conversation and walk away, a familiar sound made her freeze. Diego's laughter. Clara turned her head slightly, and there he was, still standing in the same place, talking to another group of businessmen. But now, next to him, there was another woman, and she was laughing. Melissa noticed the change in Clara's expression and followed her gaze. And that's when she saw it. A young woman, dark hair, flawless skin, a red dress that perfectly shaped her curves. She leaned slightly toward Diego, resting her hand on his arm intimately. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine. "Diego, who is that?" Her voice wavered. The young woman smiled, completely ignoring Melissa's presence. "I'm Emily. Didn't Diego tell you about me?" The entire hall seemed to fall silent at that moment. Melissa blinked, confused, trying to process what was happening. She looked at Diego, expecting an explanation, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. But he said nothing. The color disappeared from Melissa's face. Nausea overtook her body as Clara's earlier words echoed in her mind. "Life has been fair to me and you." Fair. Melissa felt the weight of that word now. Clara watched the scene without saying anything. She didn't need to. There was no satisfaction in seeing Melissa betrayed in the same way she had once been. But there was something inevitable there. The truth always finds a way to reveal itself. Diego tried to keep his composure, but Clara noticed. She saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Regret. For the first time, he really saw her not as the woman he left, but as the woman he should never have lost. But it was already too late. Clara picked up her glass and swirled the liquid around in it, unhurried. The chaos happening in front of her was no longer her problem. She was above it. She was above them all. And then, without saying a word, Clara turned away and disappeared down the hall, leaving Diego and Melissa to face the weight of their own choices. The silence between Melissa and Diego became unbearable. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in shock, and the hand holding the champagne glass trembled slightly. She looked at Emily again, as if she needed to be sure that this woman was really there next to her husband. So comfortable, so safe. "Diego." Melissa's voice came out lower than she'd intended. She cleared her throat and tried again, now with a firmer tone. "Who is this woman?" Diego ran a hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes danced between Melissa and Emily, but he said nothing. Melissa took a step forward, feeling the pressure in her chest increase. "I'm waiting, Diego." Emily, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the situation. She smiled, resting her hand gently on Diego's arm, as if he belonged to her. "Oh, dear," Emily laughed, a light but venomous sound. Don't you really know? That's embarrassing. Melissa felt her stomach turn. Every cell in her body was begging for this to be a misunderstanding, for Diego to deny it, to say something that would get her out of this humiliating position. But he didn't deny it. He didn't say anything. Instead, the room seemed to close in around Melissa as the weight of her choices and Diego's betrayal became undeniable. Clara, meanwhile, stepped into the cool Barcelona night, her head held high. She had faced her past and emerged stronger. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her life and her power. Diego just looked away, bringing the glass of champagne to his lips in a hurry, as if he wanted to hide behind it. And that's when Melissa understood. She felt a chill run down her spine. Her heart began to beat fast, not from love, but from fear. Fear that everything she had built, her image, her status, her marriage, was about to crumble in front of everyone. You! Melissa swallowed, her face contracting in a mixture of anger and disbelief. Are you cheating on me, Diego? Several heads began to turn. The hall was huge, full of businessmen, politicians, and socialites. But now many eyes were on them. A murmur began to grow around them. Diego finally looked at Melissa. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it. He didn't have a reason. I, I don't think this is the place, he muttered weakly. For what? Melissa laughed humorlessly, feeling tears burn her eyes. She pointed at Emily. So that's why you've been so distant lately. You're sleeping with this. Hey, watch your words, Emily interrupted, her voice laced with irony. You've been in my shoes before, remember? I think you know very well how this works. Melissa lost her breath for a moment. She'd been in Emily's shoes. She'd been Emily to Clara. The truth hit her like a punch. Diego walked past her, trying to minimize the scandal. He muttered something low, trying to calm her down. But Melissa was beside herself. She wasn't Clara. She wouldn't accept being discarded. You're pathetic, Diego. I gave up everything for you. I made enemies for you. I became a joke to be by your side. And now you just throw it all away for this girl. Diego sighed and wiped his hands across his face in exasperation. He looked away, aware that they were attracting too much attention. He couldn't lose his composure there. Can we talk about this later? Later, Melissa shouted. All eyes were on them now. Emily, for her part, just watched, crossing her arms and smiling. Diego took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and turned to leave. He needed a breather. He needed to think. But as soon as he had taken a few steps away from the confusion, something caught his eye from across the hall. It was Clara, and she wasn't alone. A tall, imposing man had just arrived at her side. An impeccable suit hugged his strong frame, and his smile was confident. The whole hall knew him. Mateo Alvarez, billionaire CEO, one of the most influential men in Spain. Diego watched with a tightness in his chest as Mateo placed one of his hands on Clara's waist in a natural, intimate way, as if he belonged there. Clara turned her face toward him and smiled, a genuine smile, full of something Diego hadn't seen in her for years, freedom. And then it happened. Mateo leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a quick kiss, nor was it shy. It was the kind of kiss that made it clear to everyone in the room that Clara was no longer a lonely woman, that she belonged to another man. Diego felt something cold crawl up his spine, anger, jealousy, possession. He clenched his fists at his sides, unaware that Melissa was still shouting after him, without realizing that Emily was watching him with a look of boredom. Nothing else mattered at that moment because, while he had two women fighting over him, his gaze was locked on Clara. For the first time in years, he realized that perhaps he had lost something he could never get back. Diego couldn't look away. The whole hall seemed distant. The voices around him became just muffled noises. All he could see at that moment was Clara in the arms of another man. She was radiant, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years, perhaps in a way he'd never seen before. And then, without hesitation, Mateo kissed her again, this time longer, more intentionally, as if to make it clear to everyone there that Clara was his now. Diego's stomach churned. He felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a tight lump in his throat. Jealousy, anger, a feeling of possession that he didn't even know still existed inside him. But it wasn't just that. It was something deeper, a belated recognition of what he had lost. Behind him, Melissa was still arguing, now ignored by everyone around her. She gesticulated, spoke too quickly, her voice filled with despair and indignation. Emily, on the other hand, watched the scene with a victorious smile on her lips, as if she had already known the moment would come. But Diego was no longer there, at least not in body and soul. He was completely immersed in what he was seeing across the hall. Clara turned to Mateo with an amused look, as if the excessive attention on them didn't bother her in the slightest. On the contrary, she seemed to enjoy it. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore after everything she had been through. Diego realized that nothing he did could affect her now, and that bothered him even more. He had always thought that Clara would be his shadow, that even after the divorce, she would still be there, hurt, broken, unable to move on. But now, seeing her next to Mateo, one of the most powerful figures in the country, a man who could have any woman by his side, made something inside Diego turn in a way he hadn't expected. Melissa finally noticed that he was no longer listening to her. She followed his gaze, and when she saw Clara and Mateo, her face contorted first in surprise, then in anger. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice laced with hatred. "After everything that's happened here, after humiliating me in front of everyone. Is that what you're thinking about, Diego?" Diego didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He kept watching Clara as if trying to decipher every detail of her expression. Melissa laughed in disbelief. "It can't be. You're jealous of her?" This time, Diego turned his eyes away from Clara and faced Melissa. Her gaze was filled with a mixture of pain and anger. For the first time, he really saw what he was doing. The woman he had left Clara for now stood before him, ruined, wounded, and he just didn't care. He opened his mouth to say something, but Melissa held up her hand, preventing him from speaking. "You know what, Diego? You deserve all this. You deserve to lose. You deserve to see someone else take the place that was once yours." Her words should have hit him, but they didn't. Melissa pushed him away and walked out with firm steps, ignoring the stares around her. Emily rolled her eyes and let out a low laugh before also walking away. Now Diego was alone, or at least that's how he felt. He couldn't explain what was going on inside him. He should be worrying about Melissa. He should be thinking about how to sort out the mess he'd gotten himself into. He should be focused on something other than Clara. But all he could think about was her. He watched as Mateo took her hand, leading her through the hall. They seemed like the perfect couple, and it was eating him up inside. Suddenly, Clara stopped walking. She felt something, as if she could feel Diego's eyes burning into her back. Slowly, she turned and faced him. Their gazes met. The world stopped for a second, and then Clara smiled. Not a smile of nostalgia, not a smile of spite. It was the smile of someone who had moved on, of someone who had won. It was the greatest humiliation Diego could have received. For the first time since it all began, he realized that perhaps he had never been the man Clara deserved. But now, it was too late. Soft music filled the room, but for Diego, everything seemed distant. He no longer heard the conversations around him, no longer saw the curious looks on people's faces. All that existed was Clara. She was there, laughing, radiant, talking to other people as if he'd never existed. The scene was almost surreal. For years, he'd imagined that if he ever saw her again, she would be different, perhaps tired, perhaps still resentful. But no, Clara had not only moved on, she had blossomed in a way he had never expected. Diego downed another shot of whiskey, feeling the liquid burn down his throat. It wasn't his first glass, nor the second, nor the third. He had lost count of how many times the waiter had refilled his glass. He shouldn't be drinking so much, but with every glance he threw at Clara, with every laugh she let out next to Mateo, the need to drown that unbearable feeling only grew. Why did it bother him so much? He should be satisfied. After all, he had chosen this life. He had left Clara for Melissa, thinking it would bring him happiness. But now, looking at Clara, free, confident, loved, he realized how wrong he had been. Clara glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to Mateo, leaning slightly closer to him as they shared a private joke. Diego clenched his fists, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had lost Clara not once, but twice. First when he left her, and now when he realized she no longer needed him. As the night wore on, the crowd thinned, but Diego remained, rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the woman who had once been his entire world, and who now belonged to someone else. He was Diego, a successful, powerful man who had everything he wanted. But somehow that night, he felt as if he had nothing. Melissa had left after her outburst, and Emily, realizing she would no longer have his attention, had also walked away. Now he was there, completely alone, glued to Clara, drinking nonstop. She seemed so untouchable. Diego hated to admit it, but this new version of her scared him. For years, he had been sure that Clara would always be a closed chapter, a ghost from the past that would remain trapped in his memories. But now, seeing her like this, seeing her so unperturbed, he realized the size of the mistake he had made. And then he saw the opportunity. Mateo turned away for a moment, murmuring something in Clara's ear before walking off toward the restroom. Diego waited just a few seconds before getting up, holding his glass of whiskey tightly. His heart was beating fast, but he ignored the sensation. He didn't know exactly what he would say. He didn't even know what he wanted to taste, but something inside him screamed that he needed to talk to her. Clara's back was turned when he approached, but before he could say anything, she seemed to sense his presence. She turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, Diego felt the impact. It was as if all the past came rushing back at once, crushing him. Clara stared at him for a few seconds, then unhurriedly brought the glass of champagne to her lips and took a sip. Diego. His name left her lips without emotion, without anger, without longing, just a cold acknowledgement of his presence. He swallowed. Now that he was there, he didn't know where to start. You're... He hesitated, searching for the words. Different? Clara arched an eyebrow, as if that realization was so obvious it wasn't even worth commenting on. Yes, she replied simply. Diego ran a hand through his hair, trying to find a foothold in a conversation that seemed lost even before it began. I didn't expect to see you here. Clara smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a quiet, secure smile, without any fragility. The business world is small. That was inevitable. He took a deep breath. This was turning out worse than he had imagined. Can we talk? Clara tilted her head slightly, analyzing him. About what exactly? Diego hesitated. He didn't know. He didn't know what he wanted to hear from her apologies, understanding, a chance to explain. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the alcohol on his body. I just wanted to know how you were. Clara let out a low laugh, not in mockery, but in disbelief. You want to know how I am after all this time? Diego felt his stomach turn. He didn't like the way this conversation was going. He didn't want to seem like a sorry man. He didn't want to show weakness. But standing there in front of her, he no longer knew what he was doing. Clara took a step forward. Her eyes were fixed on his, and Diego felt that, for the first time, it was he who was vulnerable in this relationship. I'm fine, Diego. Really well. Better than I've ever been. He swallowed dry. Do you miss something? She looked at him for a moment, as if pondering the answer. Then she smiled again. Yes. Diego felt his chest tighten. But before he could feel any hope, Clara added, I miss myself, the woman I was before you, the woman I left behind to try to be good enough for a man who never appreciated me. Diego blinked, feeling as if he had been hit. Clara didn't hate him, she just didn't care anymore. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, a voice came from behind him. Is there a problem here? Mateo was back. He stopped next to Clara and, without hesitation, put his hand on her waist. It was a natural, intimate touch. Diego felt every muscle in his body contract. Clara turned to Mateo and smiled in a way that made Diego feel a bitter taste in his mouth. No problem. Mateo put his arm around her, and without even a second glance at Diego, guided her away. Diego stood there, holding the empty glass. The weight of reality fell hard on him. For the first time, he realized that he had lost Clara, not because she had found another man, but because she had found something much more valuable. She had found herself. And now, there was no more room for him in her life. The hall seemed to revolve around him. He turned and walked to the bar again, feeling an emptiness growing inside him. The waiter looked at him, expecting a new order. Diego squeezed the glass in his hand, feeling the anguish grow. Give me another, he muttered. The waiter hesitated, but soon obeyed. And while Clara danced alongside Mateo, laughing and living, Diego sank deeper and deeper into his own darkness. Because now, It didn't matter how many women were by his side. He only wanted the one who would never come back. Diego left the party feeling heavy in the chest, as if something was closing in on him. The cool breeze of the Barcelona night hit his face as he stopped on the sidewalk. The echoes of music and laughter still rang out in the distance. He looked over and saw his private driver waiting nearby. But for some reason, he didn't want to get in the car. He didn't want to go home. He didn't want to face the suffocating silence of his apartment. Without thinking too much, he raised his hand and called a cab. As soon as he got in, he leaned back in the seat and let out a long sigh. "Where to?" the driver asked. Diego hesitated for a moment before giving the address. The car began to move, and he leaned his elbow on the window, watching the city lights blur past. He reached into his pocket for his cell phone, opened the screen, and on impulse went onto social media. He knew he shouldn't have, but he couldn't help it. The first thing he saw was a recent photo from the party. Clara and Mateo were together laughing. She was holding a glass of champagne and tilting her head slightly toward him, as if they were exchanging a secret. The comments were full of compliments. What a power couple. Clara deserved a man like that. Mateo and her are a perfect match. Diego must be biting himself right now, huh? He clutched the phone tightly. There was a bitter taste in his mouth. The notification of a news story appeared at the top of the screen. Mateo Alvarez and Clara Morales, the couple of the moment, the billionaire CEO and the successful businesswoman, are spotted together at a gala event, sparking rumors of a possible romance. Diego blocked the screen and threw his cell phone on the seat next to him, feeling his heart race. He didn't know if it was anger, frustration, or regret. Maybe it was all of these mixed together. The cab stopped in front of the luxury apartment building where he lived. Diego got out, ignoring the doorman who greeted him, and walked straight into the elevator. The mirror reflected his tired expression, the slightly loosened tie, the heavy eyes of someone who had had too much to drink. The door to his apartment closed behind him, and for the first time that night, the silence hit him like a blow. He took off his jacket, threw it on the sofa, and made his way to the bar. He filled a glass with whiskey, but before he could drink, he heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. He frowned. Melissa. She walked in with firm steps, wearing a different dress from the one she had worn earlier. Melissa had on a different dress from the one she had worn at the party, as if she had passed somewhere before coming there. Her face was serious, and her red eyes indicated that she had been crying. Diego took a deep breath. He wasn't in the mood for another argument. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice flat. Melissa closed the door behind her and crossed her arms. "Getting my things." She let out a low, humorless laugh. "I thought you were going to do it tomorrow. I thought you'd be a faithful husband. But look," she retorted, smiling sarcastically. Diego rolled his eyes and took a sip of his whiskey. "I don't want to fight." "Neither do I," Melissa said, moving closer and analyzing him for a moment. "But you know what's funny, Diego? I used to think you were a selfish bastard, but now I see you're even worse than that." He raised an eyebrow, bored. "Oh yeah? What else am I?" Melissa leaned forward, resting slightly on the bar stool. "A man obsessed with something he can never have again. And you know what? That makes me happy." The air seemed heavy for a moment. Diego looked away, but Melissa continued. "You didn't even realize that Emily was using you, that I was using you. You like to be desired, to feel in control. But deep down, the only thing you really want is what you can no longer have. Clara." "Clara," Diego murmured without thinking. Melissa laughed, shaking her head. "I knew it. You were blinded by her at that party, and honestly, I hope you never forget her." "Why?" "Because she forgot you a long time ago." With that, Melissa picked up her bag from the sofa, gave him one last look, and left the apartment, returning it to silence. Diego looked down at the glass of whiskey in his hand and felt a lump in his throat. He had lost Melissa, but above all, he had lost Clara, and perhaps that was the one mistake he would never be able to fix. Time passed like a blur. Emily showed up the next morning as if nothing had happened, entering the apartment with the confidence of someone who knew she still had a place there. "Good morning, love," she said brightly. Diego, who was sitting on the balcony drinking coffee and looking out over the city, didn't answer straight away. Emily came closer, slipping her arms around his neck. "Are we going out for dinner tonight?" He hesitated for a moment, but then forced a smile and nodded. Of course. If he couldn't have Clara, perhaps he should convince himself that he could still have something. But deep down, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. The months passed like a blur. Time, which had once seemed his greatest enemy, was now just a silent reminder that life went on, regardless of how he felt. Diego tried to move on. He accepted dinner invitations, frequented the same social circles, and kept his name high. But something inside him had changed. Emily was still by his side, always smiling, always perfect. She knew she had won, at least on paper. Clara was out of the game. Melissa was just a distant memory. And Emily was now the woman at Diego Ruiz's side. But deep down, Emily knew she would never have him completely. He was there, but his mind was far away. His eyes lost their sparkle whenever something about Clara came up in conversation, and that irritated her more than she would admit. Clara, on the other hand, was flourishing every day. Her company expanded, her influence grew, and her happiness became visible even to those who didn't know her. She and Mateo were seen together countless times, and each appearance seemed to confirm what many already suspected. He treated her like someone who deserved to be looked after, not as a trophy, not as a possession, but as a woman worthy of being loved. Diego tried to ignore it. He tried not to follow. But all the news reached him, whether he wanted it to or not. And over time, he began to realize something he had never admitted before. Clara hadn't just moved on, she had found herself. And what about him? He was still stuck in a cycle that led nowhere. It was on a rainy afternoon that something inside him finally gave way. He was in his office looking out of the window, the water dripping down the glass, as if it reflected exactly how he felt. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit that he was exhausted. Exhausted of running away, exhausted of pretending, exhausted of trying to fill an emptiness that seemed to grow every day. So he did something he never thought he would do. He picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and before he could change his mind, dialed a number. The call rang a few times before being answered. Hello? Clara's voice was serene, without any extra emotion. He almost gave up at that moment. Hi, Clara. The silence on the other end made his heart hammer in his chest. He knew right then that she hadn't been expecting this call. What do you want, Diego? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to find the right words. But there were no right words for what he wanted to say. I just needed to say something. He heard her breathing on the other side, patient, but not exactly interested. Say it, Diego. He swallowed. He'd never been good at admitting mistakes. He'd never been good at recognizing that he'd failed. But Clara wasn't just anyone. I hurt you, and I was an idiot for a long time. On the other side, Clara said nothing. I'm not expecting this to change anything, he continued, gripping the phone tightly. But I needed to say that I see it now. I see everything I've done. And you deserved much more than I gave you. The silence lasted long seconds. When she finally answered, there was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. I know, Diego. The simple answer, but so full of meaning, was like a punch in the chest. I just wanted you to know, he said, feeling the knot tighten in his throat. I know, she repeated. And this time there was a tone of kindness there. And then she did something he would never have expected. I hope you find your peace, Diego. He closed his eyes, feeling the words echo inside him. Thank you, Clara. And with that, the call ended. He sat there, staring at the phone, feeling a strange sensation inside him. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was acceptance. For the first time, he really accepted that Clara was never coming back. And somehow, that was liberating. Time passed, and Diego began to change. He moved away from empty parties, reduced the amount of whiskey he drank, and started to focus more on work. Not because he wanted to distract himself, but because, for the first time in years, he wanted to become someone better. Emily noticed the change, and one day she simply left. No big arguments, no fights. She just knew that her role there was over. Diego didn't stop her. He let her move on, just as Clara had, just as he himself needed to. It wasn't until years later at a charity event that Diego saw her again. Clara was standing next to Mateo, laughing with some people. He watched her from afar, and this time he didn't feel jealous. He didn't feel anger. He felt pride. She looked in his direction for a brief moment. Their gazes met, and then Clara smiled. Diego smiled back. And at that moment, he knew he was finally free. Have you ever met someone who's been through something similar? Someone who was betrayed, humiliated, but managed to turn things around and show that the best revenge is happiness? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you think about this story, and tell me, what city are you watching this video from? If you liked this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the Time Lens Stories, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos like this. And now don't leave yet. There's an incredible video popping up on your screen that you're going to love. Click and check it out.